What's up everybody, Matt Maran here for another car review. This is the 2022 Honda Civic Hatchback. So about the new hatchback version of the Civic here. Well, just like the regular Civic sedan, the hatchback gets all new styling here for 2022. And I gotta say, it looks really sharp. So it has all the same great looks as the regular Civic sedan, although it does have a unique grille up front there and a slightly different front bumper to give it a little bit of a sportier look. But otherwise, the new Civic just looks so good in my opinion. It's very lean now. They pulled back the A-pillar, so the hood looks a little bit longer now, and you also have a lower belt line so that you have more glass here on the vehicle, but it still just looks so lean and athletic, and I just think it looks great. I love those slim headlights up front there that also look nice and sharp, and it's definitely a little bit more conservative than the previous Civic styling, which was a lot bolder. I think this looks a lot better and is going to age a lot better as well. And so coming down to the sides here, you have these unique wheels here for the Sport Touring version, which is what this one is, which is the top hatchback you can get. And I think these 18-inch wheels really fill up the wheel wells nicely here on the Civic Hatch. One other thing you'll notice here is that it's a tiny bit taller for the new Civic Hatchback. So it's about 0.2 inches taller than a regular Civic sedan, so it kind of comes up a little bit more there. But overall, the whole vehicle is about 5 inches shorter than the new Civic sedan. So you'll definitely notice that there towards the back end. But all Civics here are a little over an inch longer for this generation. They're also at a 1.4 inch longer wheelbase. So definitely, a little bit of a more athletic stance as far as the wheelbase and stuff goes as well. But going out to the back, you will notice, it's a lot more stubby back there. It has great proportions still, and I really like the way they did the unique styling here for the hatchback. So, the hatch is very gradual with its slope. I also like how you have what looks like a light bar that goes the full width of the back end there. Unfortunately, it doesn't light up all the way across, but still just a cool look nonetheless. You also have a nice little rear diffuser there in the lower part of the rear bumper, and some actual exhaust cutouts there. They're not fake, they actually are there for the exhaust, and so that's great. You also have a little bit of a lip spoiler kind of integrated into the way they sculpted that rear hatch, and another cool little touch as well. I love that we have a rear wiper here on the hatch as well. And so yeah, overall, I think from every angle here, the new Civic Hatchback just looks really good. All right, so to start up and go for a drive, the new Civics here have this really nice little Honda key. I love how tiny this key is. This is probably my ideal key, honestly. It's so perfect just because it's so nice and small. Just a few buttons you need there, and that's it. I hate all these enormous keys we have these days, and I'm so happy that Honda went with a nice small key. So anyway, you can of course just leave that key in your pocket. It's keyless access, keyless entry, and push button start. So you just hit the engine start button, and it starts right up. And if you're curious to hear about the interior in the Civic Hatchback, my wife and I already did a full in-depth interior review on the 2022 sedan version of the Civic, and the interior is basically identical aside from the hatch. Even the rear seat space seems to be basically the same in my opinion. So the hatch is the big thing, and the hatch is a really nice improvement. It's a little bit bigger than the previous hatch. It's also about a 1.6 inch wider opening for the hatch compared to the last generation of the hatch, and it's a really good amount of space. I think they said it's about 25 cubic feet of space now, and so that's almost double what you get with the Civic sedan, which is 14 cubic feet. And so I mean, tons and tons of space there, nice and deep, and I just think it's very impressive. Now I will say that if you're looking for the absolute longest thing possible, I think the 5 inches of extra length in the back end of the Civic sedan means the trunk might be a tiny bit longer than this hatch, but of course with the hatch being way taller, you can fit way more stuff in here. So definitely the more practical choice. And also when you lift up the floor there, you'll see a spare tire still too, which is really impressive considering just how deep that hatch is. To still have a spare is great. And so overall, a really nice hatchback setup there. And it also is kind of different now. You don't have any kind of extra rear window like you used to have, where it was kind of a split view thing in the previous generation Civic Hatch. Now it's just one piece of glass there, but still a really great view out of the back too, in addition to the great view you have all around you here in these new Civics. They're just so good with the visibility. But yeah, definitely check out the full interior review if you want to hear all the details on this interior in the Civic. All right, so setting off here in the Civic Hatchback. So the first thing you notice, well, this one is the manual Sport Touring, and so this manual transmission I really enjoy. It's not quite as sweet as it is in the SI. I really loved that setup in the SI. This is a close second, and it certainly is improved over the previous generation Civic Hatch, which had a lot more rev hang and just didn't have as good of a feeling shifter as this one. This one has a little bit more resistance to the shifter that feels really nice, but the clutch is nice and easy to use, and yeah, the fact that there's very little rev hang. I think it might be a tiny bit more than the SI. I'd have to drive them back to back, but this seemed to be holding the revs a little bit more than the SI did. But it's a really great driving experience. I love driving this new generation Civic. Everything is just dialed into perfection in my opinion. Steering is a perfect weight. It's not too light, it's not trying to be too heavy either. It's just right. It just feels natural and just good. Same thing goes, the brakes have a good amount of feel to them. They're not overly touchy, but they're also not too dead. You know, just a good amount of bite, feel exactly like how you want them to feel, honestly. Otherwise, you know, throttle response is pretty good here for a turbocharged 4-cylinder, and you know, pretty responsive. It's unfortunate though that here in the Sport Touring, the manuals do not get any kind of sport mode, so you can't sharpen up throttle response or anything like you can in the CVT versions, or like what you can get, of course, in the SI. So, you know, as far as a sportiness standpoint goes, you know, it's nice to have the manual, but, you know, they're still holding back on a couple of the features, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue to drive here. But the engine is just so responsive. It has nice meaty torque, even lower in the RPM band here, and it sounds a little bit better for this generation of the Civic than it did in the previous generation, even though it's the same basic engine. Just, I don't know, it just feels really nice to drive. I love driving these new Civics. Every single one, both the regular sedan, the SI, and the hatch here now. Every time I get in them, I just like feel like I'm at home, and I just love driving them. They just feel so good. But anyway, let's turn down onto this back road here and see how it accelerates. And here we go. Okay. Chirp second, and it works hard, but it gets up and goes nicely here. So it's a good amount of punch, and it actually pulls pretty nicely all the way to that 6,500 RPM red line as well. So it runs the 1.5 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. It does 180 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque. And so 0 to 60 is about 7.3 seconds. And so for those of you who are trying to weigh this versus the SI, it's about a half second slower 0 to 60 for this over the SI. You're also, of course, losing about 15 pound-feet of torque and 20 horsepower compared to the SI. But this engine still is, you know, a really good feeling engine. It's just good amount of punch. Now, you know, it does feel like a 7-second 0 to 60 car. So this is the type of car you can't be scared to floor it. You can't be scared to work this engine, but it's rewarding, it's engaging, and it's fun. And I love, you know, stirring the pot here and, you know, wringing this little engine out as best as I can here. And, you know, it's a gratifying experience. I really enjoy it. Yes, you know, if you want the most power, I definitely suggest going for the SI. That feels a good bit punchier. Even though it's only 20 horsepower and 15 pound-feet of torque on paper, I would argue it feels punchier than that. I haven't seen dynos for the Sport Touring hatch here, but I do know the SI is underrated from the factory and is most likely doing closer to 230 horsepower at the crank. I'm not sure if this is underrated similarly, but this does feel a good bit slower than the SI and a little bit less punchy. But I mean, I still think it just feels really good, and again, paired up with a really good manual, it's a really good experience. The CVT though isn't terrible. For those of you who are curious, I did review the CVT in the regular Civic sedan, since the sedans only come with the automatic CVT there, and you know, they're pretty good still. It's one of the better CVTs. It didn't annoy me too much, but the manual is certainly more fun. But on this rougher road here that we're on, road noise is actually not too bad. The Civic's one of the most refined in its segment, and it just feels really nice to roll around in. But anyway, we're counting some corners here, and let's see how the Sport hatch handles. So good for the handling here. I'm just gonna roll in second here because this little engine actually sounds pretty good now whenever it's in the upper RPM ranges here. But really good amount of handling here. So I mean, you know, the longer wheelbase here for this generation, you know, being 1.4 inches longer certainly helps with the handling. We're also running 235 wide tires on these 18-inch wheels as well. 235s are pretty wide for an economy car, and so it means you have a lot of meat. You also have, you know, a nice lightweight vehicle here. These weigh about 100 pounds or so heavier than an SI, at least the Sport Tourings here, with all of the, you know, extra tech and stuff you get here in this, and the leather and stuff you don't get in the SI. It's just over 3,000 pounds, but I mean, we're still talking about a vehicle that's 3,000 pounds. In 2022, you know, that's a novel thing, honestly, and so, I mean, it just means that this thing loves the corner carve. It feels so good around corners. It's just really fun, and, you know, for those who do enjoy driving a slow car fast, you know, this is one of those instances where, you know, it's just fun, especially now since you have a turbo motor. It's not like you're just wringing out an engine going nowhere. Like, you know, it has good punch down low, so you're not waiting forever for power, and it never feels you know, like it's really, you know, out of the power band or anything. So it feels really good in that regard. But it is worth noting one other thing is in regards to the power, this turbo motor is only in these touring trims and these upper trims. So the only other way, so you can get a manual hatch Civic also in a regular sport trim. If you go for that regular sport trim, you don't get this engine, unfortunately. You then go down to the 2-liter 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine, does 158 horsepower. So I mean, you're down to, you know, an extra 22 more horsepower there. And it's going to be a little bit lighter because it doesn't have all the luxury features this does as well. But just, you know, that's an important thing. It's just because they're both sport, they don't have the same engine. It's a little bit confusing there. So touring is going to be the way to go if you do want this punchiest engine. And we'll do another acceleration. I even had the wheels turn that time to try and see if I had any issues with not having a limited slip diff, but I have no issues here. So I mean, it's a dry day, maybe in the wet or something, I'd appreciate it more. But that's the one thing, you know, you don't have the limited slip differential like you get in the SI, but I'm not feeling a need for it currently. I'm not missing it or anything. So, you know, not sure if that's a huge deal when you're talking about, you know, this level of power. You know, it's not like this thing's going to be shredding tires everywhere it goes or anything. So not a huge deal, but you know, that is one other thing to mention is, you know, the limited slip diff. Another thing you're also losing is you have no auto rev match downshifts like you get in the SI. It's kind of a bummer because that'd be a really nice thing to have here in this as well, but you don't have that. Rev matching yourself is fine. It's just that, you know, again, the engine is a little slower to rev up sometimes. So it's not the easiest to rev match downshifts. And I honestly feel like the lighter flywheel that they have specifically for the SI really helps, even if you do want to turn that off and you want to do it yourself. It's a little easier to do in the SI than it is here in this, but it still isn't too bad, and you know, is going to be a little bit easier, I think, certainly than the previous generation Civic Hatch. I'm going to try and just apply the gas early coming out of these corners and see if I can really get these tires to want me to have an LSD, but I think... Alright, so I felt the inside wheel spinning a little bit there, but, you know, it's not sloppy by any means. This isn't a car that desperately needs a limited slip diff. It's not like, for example, the stuff, you know, that Kia and Hyundai do with the Elantra N-Line and the Kia K5 GT. Those things are just like wheel spin machines. And honestly, even Honda's own Accord with the 2.0 motor, that definitely feels like it needs a limited slip diff at some points. But this, not really. It just, it's so tossable. It's just like, I love this thing. It is so good, and the more that I do rev match, it really is still so easy. This whole car just wants to play with you. It just wants to work with you. It's just so in tune with the driver, and I absolutely love it. It's just fantastic. So neutral, so eager. No signs of understeer, nothing. It's honestly perfect. It's absolutely perfect in the setup, in my opinion. I absolutely love the way this thing drives. And now we're hitting some potholes here. For those who are wondering about the comfort here in the hatchback, it's still really good. I mean, you know, especially being the sport touring one, you know, they had a really good blend of, you know, making it so that it's still comfortable, but still sporty as well, so that it feels great on a back grid. But, you know, as we're hitting some potholes here, we'll hit some more. Yeah, it's totally fine. The ride is so good in these new Civics, and yeah, it just does its happy medium thing of, you know, giving you enough road feel without making it feel floaty or anything, but also making it so that it's not overly harsh as well, and you know, just so accept the bumps really well. So I think part of that goes back to that longer wheelbase, which really helps to kind of spread things out a little bit and give you that more stable and planted feeling. And now I'm out on the highway here in the Civic Hatch, and I also have the adaptive cruise control system on, which does have the lane keep assist and the traffic jam assist that it all has, and it does a really good job. This system has always been really good, and it's improved here for this new generation Civic as well, so that now it has a wider field of view for the cameras here, and their system, it's just, the lane keeping is really natural. It doesn't ping pong, and it does a really good job of figuring out, you know, just how to stay in the center of the lane. And I also like that sometimes it does seem to be kind of keeping towards the right hand side of the lane, which I also really appreciate. You know, I'd rather be closer to the shoulder than the middle there, and so it's doing a great job with all of that. And This is a great highway cruiser as well. I mean, you hear a little bit of road noise. This is an economy car still, after all, and a compact sedan, but it does a really good job. It is worth noting, of course, here with the manual, you don't have the stop and go functionality that you do get with the automatic versions of the Civic. And there's a few other features, like it doesn't do as much of the automatic braking stuff here in the manual, but still has all the same great, safety tech otherwise. The Sport Tourings here do have blind spot monitoring, but it's worth noting the regular Sports do not. So, if blind spot monitoring is important to you, you're going to have to go up to these higher trims as well for that. There's also just a lot of great improvements as far as the safety structure here for the Civic as well. And on top of that, there's even new airbags. They have new airbag designs to help limit your head motion and stuff. So even if all the safety systems fail, the car still will protect you very well. And so it's great that Honda focuses on all the aspects of safety, not just the tech like everyone else likes to focus on these days, but also the structure, the airbags, making innovations in all those areas as well. But anyway, thanks to Honda, I'm going to have the Civic Hatch here for an entire week. So I'm going to drive around all over the place, and I'll come back and give you guys my final real-world fuel economy, as well as my thoughts on the pricing, how it compares to its competition, and anything else here that I noticed during my week of driving. Alright, so I've been driving the Civic Sport Hatchback here for about a week now, and I still really love it. I mean, I think I just get into a nice rhythm with this car as far as running through the gears. Everything is just so gratifying and enjoyable. There is still, I think, a tiny bit more rev hang than the SI, but it hasn't been enough to bother me. It certainly is less than what you get in like the Corolla hatchback, and so I just really love driving it, and I'm not going to repeat everything else I said in the beginning of this video. So, and it was also a really nice dad car to run around in. I have a baby seat in the back there. It's one of the rear-facing ones that's really big, and it actually fit pretty well. I was pretty impressed, and I think that this spaciousness of the Civic Hatch is one thing that sets it apart and sets it above from all the other hatchback competitors in this segment that it competes with. But I mean, even still, like me being 5'9", sitting in the passenger seat, I still have like over an inch of legroom to spare there, so I was actually able to sit there fairly comfortably. I wasn't really hugging the dashboard too much, and so I'm just impressed that this car is just so practical and usable. But it wasn't all perfect during my week with this car, so there's a couple interesting little things I noticed. The first is that somehow there was a little bit of water that got into the hatch right by the spare tire area there under the floor, and I actually could hear it sloshing around a tiny bit at times as well. I'm not sure why. It does look like there's a decently sized panel gap there on the passenger side of the hatch. I'm not sure if that's just like an early production or pre-production issue with this car in particular, but just check the panel gap. I'm not sure if that's why this car has the little bit of a water issue, what the deal is with that, but probably just a one-off thing with this one, but just wanted to mention that was just something out of the ordinary I haven't seen even in any other pre-production vehicle I've reviewed in the past. Another thing was that the wireless smartphone integration didn't work perfectly for some reason. I'm not sure why, but it just never automatically connected to my smartphone. I'm not sure if the connection just wasn't very good or what the deal was with that. In my week with the Civic Si and in my week with the regular Civic sedan, I had no issues whatsoever, so I think that might also just be a little quirk to this car. But that's really it as far as my complaints with it. The only other things to talk about here are the pricing and the fuel economy. So first we'll talk about fuel economy. So over about 95 miles of driving here, I've been averaging 28.6 mpg, which I'm really happy with because these are rated at 28 mpg in the city, 37 on the highway, and 31 combined. So to be getting over the city rating, when by the way I did basically just around town 35 mile per hour cruising, I really didn't do any highway driving outside of the first little bit earlier in the review. It was just around town running errands kind of stuff, and I'm still overperforming that city rating. And typically in my reviews here, I get 1 to 2 mpg less than the city rating with my driving and stuff. And this is also winter time as well, so that also dropped it a little bit. I was seeing over 29 mpg before I was sitting in a drive-through line for a few minutes. So, I'm just very impressed with that, considering, this is still turbocharged, and, oftentimes with turbos, that kind of kills some of your fuel economy a little bit. But in this, not the case. This motor is very fuel efficient, but it is worth noting that my week with the SI, which has extra power, I actually was getting 30 mpg. Now I did a little bit more highway driving in that probably helped. So I'd say they're about even though. So, if you're worried about the SI getting worse fuel economy or something, I wouldn't. They're basically rated identically. and in my real world experience here, they seem to be very much the same as far as fuel economy goes as well. So, but still just really good, solid fuel economy. And it's also just unique because this is the only turbocharged competitor in this whole space. Everything else that offers a hatchback in this segment, they are all naturally aspirated engines still. And so having the turbo punch and the lower RPM ranges of this, I think will make this feel a little punchy around town and mean that you have to work a little less hard to get going in this versus all the competitors. But anyway, I'm just really happy with that fuel economy. But the last thing to mention here is the pricing and how it compares to those competitors. So these aren't cheap. That's the one caveat with these. So this one, as tested, is just over $31,000 actually. And that is pricey. That's higher than all the competitors, by the way, but it's worth noting you get way more equipment in this than all the competitors. None of the competitors give you fully digital gauges. The infotainment system's better than basically everything. The Mazda 3 has a similar size screen, but it's not touchscreen. The Mazda 3 does have a fantastic Bose stereo, just like how this has a fantastic Bose stereo as well. So it's kind of a tie there as far as those two go. But otherwise, I mean, you get way more stuff here. Some of the others don't give you full leather seats. This is full leather. There's just, you know, more premium feeling cabin in this for the most part. The Mazda 3 also, though, is very premium feeling, but the thing with the Mazda 3, there's a couple little drawbacks, but the main thing is that it's a little bit smaller, so that back seat isn't as big as it is here in the Civic, and the hatchback is also smaller in the Mazda 3 than it is here in this. So this is going to be definitely the most practical of all the competitors, by the way. But the Mazda 3 is the closest competitor in my opinion, because those are right around $30,000, and they give you a little more power. It's 186 horsepower and 186 pound-feet of torque with the naturally aspirated 2.5 liter motor, and that is manual transmission in that top loaded trim as well, which gives you all the kind of same features you get here in this. And so that's really the best direct competitor, and the fact that it's about $1,000 less than this and it has more power than this does, if you don't need the most space possible, I would say that the Mazda 3 hatch is a slightly better value, all things considered. And if you're someone who doesn't want the manual transmission here, you can go for the automatic in the Mazda 3 hatch, of course, as well. And with the automatic, it's a real automatic with 6 actual gears. It's not a CVT like all the other competitors. And so if you're someone who likes that traditional transmission feeling, you have that in the Mazda. And also that also means that whenever you go down to the lower versions of the Mazda 3, which aren't available with a manual, they all still get the same 186 horsepower across the board. Whereas in the Civics here, only this top touring trim gets the bigger engine, and that's the only way you get the manual as well if you want this engine. If you are okay with less power, you can get the Civic hatchback here with the naturally aspirated 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, but that only does 158 horsepower and only like 138 pound-feet of torque. So way down on power, and you know, whenever you're comparing that to 186 pound-feet of torque you get in the base Mazda 3 hatchback, I mean, it's just going to be way punchier for the Mazda over this. And by the way, the Mazda starts at very similar money. They're basically, you know, the same as far as pricing goes on the low end there. So you know, that's why I still think the Mazda 3 is the best value overall, as long as space is not an issue for you. But obviously, if you're going for a hatch and you're going for, you know, a vehicle like this, you're probably going to want the most space possible. And so that's why I still think, you know, the Civic might make more sense for more people than the Mazda 3. It just comes down to your individual situation. The other little competitors I want to mention very briefly are that you can also get a Corolla hatchback from Toyota with the manual transmission. They also offer the manual across the board, and it's all the same engines across the board as well. But it is less power than this touring trim, but you also pay a lot less for those Corolla hatchbacks. So a loaded hatchback does have a lot less features than this does, so it's not a fair comparison, but you can get a loaded Corolla XSE hatchback with the manual for about $25,000. That has 168 horsepower. So it's only down, you know, about 12 horsepower from this, but torque is way down at 151 pound-feet of torque. But whenever you again compare that to the base Civic hatch, you know, that actually the Corolla has a little bit more power, and you get, I think, a few more features in that, you know, 25 grand Corolla than you do in the 25 grand Civic here. And it's also worth noting the Corolla is also going to be a little bit tighter as far as its backseat and its hatch. It's actually got a pretty small hatch, unfortunately. So that's one other knock on the Corolla, and another way where the Civic really does come out ahead a little bit. The last thing I do have to say about pricing is $31,000 is a little problematic even within the Honda range, because for $3,000 or so less, you can get an actual Civic Si. Yes, you lose the hatch thing, but you also get a nice large trunk in the Civic and the same spacious back seat and everything. for $3,000 less, and you get more power, the limited slip differential. You lose the leather, you lose the heated seats, but with cloth seats, I feel like not having the heat isn't quite as big of a deal. You still get the same great infotainment, the same great stereo. Gauges aren't quite as nice. There are some downgrades, you know, with that SI trade-off. But I think if you're an enthusiast, your money's better spent, you know, a little bit less money as well, getting that SI over this Sport Touring. But if you must have the hatch, one last thing I want to mention is that you can get an Integra here in 2022 now. Those are going to be available here this spring. And I don't have exact pricing for the Integra yet, but it's been rumored to start around $35,000 with the manual transmission and fully loaded, which will then give you even more features, like they have 12-way power seats with more adjustments. They have a more advanced 12-speaker stereo system with speakers in the roof, and you have a few other nicer features. And those actually do give you the SI powertrain, you know, with the limited slip diff, 200 horsepower, and all of that. And with this at 31, if it does in fact turn out to be 35 or so for an Integra, $4,000 more for way more luxury, you know, and having a little bit more power as well and stuff. I think there could be a potential value play there as well, and that might actually make more sense for just $4,000 more. If you're already over 30 grand, you know, another $4 grand to get nicer, accurate vehicle, you know, might be worthwhile for some people as well. So again, that will come down to final pricing with the Integra, but that's just one more thing to keep on your radar if you are cross shopping for a hatchback with a manual, you know, in this segment. You know, that would be another one that I would certainly look into. But anyway, that's it as far as all of my thoughts here on the Civic Hatch. Overall, still, I really love it, you know, and so regardless of, you know, the pricing and all that, I think it's a really fun and very lovable little car that is a really great companion and would be such a fun daily driver. I'd love to have something like this for running errands with all the time. It's just a really fun little thing, and it's so good on gas. It'd be a great commuter car, stuff like that as well. But anyway, that's all of my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on the Civic Hatch in the comments below. Huge thanks to Honda for providing me here with the Civic Hatch to review for you guys today. And yeah, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.